The rain came down in sheets that August morning in 1944, turning the Norman soil into a slick, churning mess that swallowed boots and truck tires with equal indifference. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb stood outside the canvas tent that served as his operations center, a cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers as he watched another convoy rumble past. 18 trucks, their olive-drab paint streaked with mud, their engines grinding in protest against the grade. Behind him, through the tent flap, he could hear the radio man's voice crackling through static, reporting another fuel shortage at the front. Always fuel, always ammunition, always food. The Germans had laughed at American logistics before the invasion, called them soft, said they'd fold when the supply line stretched. Webb took a long drag and wondered if maybe, just this once, the bastards had been right. The tent smelled of diesel fuel, wet canvas, and the particular staleness that came from too many men working in too small a space for too many hours without sleep. Inside, maps covered every available surface. Tactical maps showing front-line positions, logistics maps tracking supply routes, terrain maps highlighting bridges and crossroads, and the narrow French roads that hadn't been built for Sherman tanks. Webb's executive officer, Major Tom Delaney, hunched over the main planning table, his glasses catching the light from the kerosene lamp as he scribbled calculations on a pad of paper. The numbers never worked. No matter how Delaney arranged them, shuffled priorities, juggled allocations, the arithmetic of modern warfare remained stubbornly, impossibly unbalanced. "We're short 30,000 gallons for Third Army alone," Delaney said without looking up. His voice carried the flat exhaustion of a man who delivered the same bad news so many times it had lost its power to shock. "That's just today. Tomorrow it'll be worse. Patton's moving faster than anyone predicted, and every mile he advances is another mile we have to truck supplies." Webb crushed out his cigarette and stepped inside, letting the tent flap fall closed behind him. Water dripped from his field jacket onto the dirt floor, each drop making a small crater in the dust that somehow persisted despite the rain outside. He'd been running logistics for the U.S. Third Army since D-Day, back when it was still just plans and projections, back when the biggest worry had been getting the men and equipment to cross the channel. Now, 6 weeks after the invasion, the scope of the challenge had become terrifyingly clear. The Allied advance was consuming supplies faster than the ports could deliver them, faster than the trucks could haul them, faster than any peacetime logistics officer could have imagined. "Patton knows?" Webb asked, though he already knew the answer. "Patton knows, and Patton doesn't care," Delaney replied, finally looking up. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face unshaven. "He called again an hour ago. Said if we can't keep his tanks fueled, he'll appropriate what he needs from other units." His words. Webb allowed himself a grim smile. George S. Patton, Jr., commanding general of the Third Army, was many things: brilliant, ruthless, profane, and utterly indifferent to the practical limitations that govern lesser mortals. He drove his men hard and his tanks harder, and he expected his logistics officers to perform miracles on demand. The problem was, miracles required resources they simply didn't have. The door flap rustled again, and Captain Sarah Brennan entered, bringing with her another gust of wet air and the smell of gasoline. She was Webb's transportation officer, responsible for managing the fleet of trucks that formed the arteries of their supply network. At 32, she was older than most captains, had worked for a trucking company in Detroit before the war, and knew more about moving freight than half the men in the European theater. She also had the habit of telling Webb exactly what he didn't want to hear, which is why he valued her opinion more than almost anyone else's. "The Red Ball Express is breaking down," she announced without preamble, pulling off her steel helmet and shaking water from her short dark hair. "We've got men falling asleep at the wheel, running off roads, crashing into each other because they're too exhausted to see straight. We've been running 20-hour shifts for 3 weeks. Something's got to give." The Red Ball Express. The name had started as a railroad term, borrowed from the practice of marking priority freight trains with red balls, and someone had adapted it for the truck convoys that now supplied the advancing armies. One-way routes marked with red balls painted on signs, trucks rolling day and night, drivers pushing themselves and their vehicles to the breaking point. It was working, barely, but Sarah was right. They were approaching the limits of what human endurance could sustain.
Webb moved to the map table and studied the web of red lines showing supply routes from the beaches to the front. Cherbourg was operational now, the port finally cleared of German demolitions, but it was still hundreds of miles behind Patton's spearhead. The trucks were covering that distance, then turning around and doing it again, an endless loop that devoured tires, brake pads, engine oil, and human stamina in equal measure. "We need more trucks," Webb said, knowing even as he spoke that it was pointless. "We need shorter routes. We need the Germans to stop blowing up every bridge and railroad line between here and Paris." "We need magic," Delaney muttered. "We need to violate the laws of physics." Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down hard, her shoulders slumping with fatigue. "There's talk among the drivers," she said quietly. "Some of them saying they're being worked harder than they ever were back home. And for what? So Patton can race Montgomery to Berlin? They signed up to fight Germans, not to drive trucks until they collapse." That was dangerous talk, the kind that could spread like disease through an exhausted unit. Morale was a resource too, as finite and as precious as gasoline, and twice as volatile. Webb had seen good units fall apart when morale broke, had seen men simply stop caring, stop trying, stop functioning. He couldn't let that happen to his drivers, not now, not when so much depended on keeping those trucks rolling. "Get me the numbers on driver casualties," Webb said. "Not combat casualties. Accidents, illness, exhaustion. I want to know exactly how bad it is." Sarah nodded, making a note on her clipboard. "And if the numbers are as bad as I think they are, then we'll figure something out," Webb said, with more confidence than he felt. "We always do." But as he said it, he thought about the German generals he'd heard about, the ones captured in the early days after the invasion, who'd been so contemptuous of American logistics capabilities. They'd fought the Russians, fought across the Eastern Front where supply lines stretched across a continent and men froze or starved as often as they died in combat. They'd looked at American planning, at the careful calculations and timetables, and they'd laughed, called the Americans soft, said they'd never survive a real war of movement, a real test of endurance, said their trucks and their gasoline and their hot meals would mean nothing when the fighting got hard. Webb wanted to prove them wrong, needed to prove them wrong. But standing in that tent, looking at the maps that showed impossible distances and the reports that documented impossible demands, he felt the weight of that contempt pressing down on his shoulders like a physical thing. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere to the east, Patton's tanks were still rolling forward, still consuming fuel and ammunition and hope at a rate that made the mathematicians weep. And behind them, stretching back across the mud of France, the Red Ball Express trucks kept rolling, kept driving, kept dying by inches on those narrow roads, because there was no other choice, because the alternative was letting the Germans win, and that was unthinkable. Webb looked at the small photograph he kept tucked into the corner of the mapboard, his wife Martha and their 2 daughters, taken in the backyard of their home in Kansas 3 years ago, before the world had gone mad. They were smiling in the picture, the girls squinting against the sun, Martha with her hand shading her eyes. He'd written to her last week, told her things were going well, told her not to worry. He hadn't mentioned the fuel shortages, or the exhausted drivers, or the German general's laughter. Some truths were too heavy to send home in a letter. "Sir," Delaney's voice pulled him back to the present. "Bradley's headquarters is on the line. They want an update on our capabilities for supporting a breakthrough toward Paris." Paris. The prize that would make all of this worthwhile. the symbol that would prove the invasion was succeeding, that the liberation was real. Patton wanted it desperately, wanted his name in the history books beside the victories. And to get there, he needed fuel. Thousands upon thousands of gallons of fuel flowing forward in an endless stream, defying the mud and the rain and the sheer crushing mathematics of distance. Webb picked up the radio handset, gathering his thoughts, preparing to tell more lies about capabilities they didn't quite have, making promises he wasn't entirely sure he could keep. This was the work of logistics officers in wartime, managing the gap between what was needed and what was possible, stretching resources beyond their breaking point, and, somehow, impossibly, keeping everything from falling apart. But as he prepared to speak, a thought crystallized in his mind, sharp and clear, and possibly insane. What if they stopped trying to do the impossible in the conventional way? What if they stopped pretending that careful planning and measured distribution would somehow solve a problem that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional logistics? What if they did something so audacious, so unprecedented, that it would either save the advance or end in spectacular failure? He thought about those German generals again, their contempt, their certainty that Americans couldn't match their hard-won expertise in sustained operations. And he thought about proving them wrong, not through careful competence, but through sheer, desperate innovation.
"Tell Bradley I'll call him back in 30 minutes, Webb said, setting down the handset. "I need to talk to some people first." Delaney and Sarah exchanged glances, recognizing the tone in his voice, the one that preceded either brilliant solutions or catastrophic mistakes, with no middle ground between them. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. Webb looked at the map again, at the red lines showing their supply routes, at the blue arrows marking Patton's advance, and at the vast gap between them that was growing wider every day. And he smiled. The kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the kind that said he was about to do something that would either earn him a medal or a court-martial. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that maybe it's time we stopped playing by the rules the Germans expect us to follow. I'm thinking maybe we need to build something they've never seen before, something so fast and so efficient that it turns their logistics expertise into a joke. I'm thinking we need to paint those red balls a different color." "What color?" Delaney asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew the answer, already saw where Webb's thoughts were leading. "Green," Webb said. "We're going to paint them green. And we're going to show those German generals what American logistics can really do." Marcus Webb hadn't always been a logistics officer, and he certainly hadn't grown up dreaming of spending his war behind a desk, juggling numbers and supply manifests while other men fought. He'd been born in Topeka, Kansas in 1908, the second son of a railroad freight manager who taught him from an early age that the world ran on movement, the movement of goods, of raw materials, of finished products flowing from factories to markets. His father, James Webb, had worked for the Santa Fe Railroad for 37 years, rising from yard worker to operations manager through sheer competence and an almost supernatural ability to visualize how freight moved across complex networks. Young Marcus had spent his summers working in the rail yards, learning to read shipping manifests before he was 12, understanding the intricate dance of boxcars and loading schedules and tonnage calculations before most boys his age had figured out long division. His father would bring him to the observation tower overlooking the main yard, pointing out how a single delayed train could cascade through the entire system, how efficiency was always about finding the bottlenecks and eliminating them, how the difference between profit and bankruptcy often came down to whether you could move something 50 miles in 4 hours instead of 5. Logistics, his father had told him once, standing in that tower while the sun set over a maze of tracks, is the art of making the impossible merely difficult. Anyone can move things when you've got unlimited time and unlimited resources. The real skill is moving what needs to move, when it needs to move there, with what you've actually got. Everything else is just arithmetic. Webb had gone to the University of Kansas on a scholarship, studied industrial management, graduated in 1930 just as the Depression was turning the country inside out. Jobs were scarce, especially for college graduates with no practical experience beyond summer work in rail yards. He'd taken a position with a freight company in Kansas City, working as a route planner, applying his father's lessons to the growing network of trucks that was beginning to challenge the railroad's dominance. It was tedious work, calculating mileage and fuel costs and driver hours, but Webb had found a strange satisfaction in making the numbers work, in finding the elegant solution that saved time or money or both. He'd married Martha Henley in 1933, a schoolteacher from Lawrence with a sharp mind and a sharper wit, who'd been unimpressed by his talk of freight routes and delivery schedules, but charmed by his quiet competence and his habit of fixing things without being asked. They'd had 2 daughters, Elizabeth in 1934 and Caroline in 1936, and Webb had settled into a life that seemed solid and predictable, anchored in the geography of the Great Plains and the rhythms of a growing family. The war in Europe had seemed distant at first, something happening to other people in other countries, important perhaps, but not relevant to a freight manager in Kansas. But Pearl Harbor had changed that, had changed everything. And Webb had enlisted 3 days later, driven by a sense of duty he couldn't quite articulate and a growing certainty that his particular skills might actually matter in the conflict that was coming. He'd expected to be assigned to the Transportation Corps. His civilian experience made that almost inevitable, but he'd hoped for something more active, something that felt more like fighting. Instead, he'd been sent to Fort Lee in Virginia, to a school that taught logistics and supply chain management to officers who would be responsible for keeping armies fed, fueled, and armed across distances that staggered the imagination. The instructors had been a mix of regular Army officers and civilian experts pulled from companies like General Motors and Standard Oil, men who understood that modern warfare was as much about production capacity and distribution networks as it was about bullets and bombs. They taught him to think in terms of tonnage and truck miles and pipeline capacity, to see an army not as a collection of fighting men, but as a vast machine that consumed resources at predictable rates and would simply stop functioning if those resources didn't arrive on schedule.
Webb had been good at it, better than good, and by the time the planning for Operation Overlord began in earnest, he'd been promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to Bradley's staff with responsibility for logistics planning for what would become the Third Army. He'd spent months working on the invasion, calculating how many trucks would be needed to support how many divisions across how many miles of French roads, factoring in variables like weather and enemy action and the inevitable chaos that would follow the initial assault. But all that planning, all those careful calculations had collided with the reality of George S. Patton, Jr., a man who treated logistics plans the way a flood treats carefully arranged furniture. Patton had taken command of the Third Army just before the breakout from Normandy, and he'd immediately begun demanding the impossible: faster advances, deeper penetrations, more aggressive exploitation of any gap in German defenses. And he'd expected his logistics officers to make it all happen, to somehow conjure the fuel and ammunition required to support operations that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional planning. Webb had spent the last 6 weeks in a state of controlled crisis, watching his carefully constructed supply plans disintegrate under the pressure of Patton's ambitions. The general had a gift for warfare, could read terrain and enemy dispositions with an intuitive genius that left professional staff officers shaking their heads in admiration. But he had absolutely no patience for the practical limitations imposed by fuel consumption rates and truck availability, and the simple fact that gasoline weighed 8 pounds per gallon and had to be physically transported across hundreds of miles of damaged roads. The tension between them had come to a head 2 weeks earlier, in a meeting at Patton's headquarters that Webb still replayed in his mind during sleepless nights.
The general had summoned him personally, had kept him waiting 40 minutes before finally deigning to see him, and then had proceeded to explain, with the kind of profane eloquence that made Patton famous, exactly what he thought of logistics officers who told him what he couldn't do. "Webb," Patton had said, his voice soft and dangerous, "I don't give a good goddamn about your fuel allocations or your truck maintenance schedules or any other excuse you're about to give me for why my tanks are sitting idle when there are Germans that need killing. Your job is to find a way to keep my army moving, not to tell me it can't be done, not to explain why the mathematics don't work, to find a way." Webb had stood at attention, his jaw clenched, feeling the decades of his father's teachings warring with the desire to tell this arrogant son of a bitch exactly where he could stick his demands. But he'd kept his voice level when he replied, "Sir, with respect, I can find ways to bend the rules of logistics. I cannot find ways to violate the laws of physics. Your advance is consuming fuel faster than we can deliver it. That's not an opinion, it's arithmetic." Patton had stared at him for a long moment, his pale blue eyes unblinking, and Webb had been certain he was about to be relieved of command, sent home in disgrace, his military career ending in failure. But then Patton had smiled, a thin and humorless expression that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less. "Then change the arithmetic. Be creative. Be audacious. Be willing to fail spectacularly if that's what it takes. Because I'll tell you what arithmetic the Germans are doing right now. They're calculating how fast they can retreat before we catch them. And they're factoring in their assumption that American logistics will fail. Prove them wrong, Colonel. Show them we can do things they never imagined possible. Show them why they should have stayed the hell out of this war." Webb had spent the last 6 weeks in a state of controlled crisis, watching his carefully constructed supply plans disintegrate under the pressure of Patton's ambitions. The general had a gift for warfare, could read terrain and enemy dispositions with an intuitive genius that left professional staff officers shaking their heads in admiration. But he had absolutely no patience for the practical limitations imposed by fuel consumption rates and truck availability and the simple fact that gasoline weighed 8 pounds per gallon and had to be physically transported across hundreds of miles of damaged roads. That night, unable to sleep, Webb walked through the motor pool where hundreds of trucks sat in neat rows, their engines silent, their tires settling into the mud. He'd thought about the drivers who operated these vehicles, men like Corporal Danny Martinez from New Mexico, who'd been a long-haul trucker before the war and who drove with a kind of casual confidence that made impossibly tight deadlines seem routine. Or Private First Class James Washington from Mississippi, who'd learned to maintain engines as a teenager working in his uncle's garage, and who could diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone, fixing issues in minutes that would have left factory-trained mechanics baffled for hours. These were the men who would make any plan work or fail, not the generals, not the staff officers, but the drivers and mechanics and supply clerks who actually moved the freight, who actually kept the trucks running, who actually turned logistics plans into logistics reality. Webb had grown up around these men, had worked beside them in rail yards and freight depots, and he knew that they possessed a kind of practical wisdom that formal planning could never fully capture.
He'd found Martinez in the motor pool mess tent, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, his eyes red-rimmed from fatigue. The corporal had driven 36 hours straight on the last convoy, pushing through exhaustion and German artillery fire to deliver ammunition to a forward unit that was surrounded and running low. He'd made it, had turned around and driven back, and had reported for his next assignment 4 hours later. "Corporal," Webb had said, sitting down across from him without invitation, "tell me honestly, how much longer can you and the other drivers keep up this pace?" Martinez had studied him for a moment, weighing whether this was a trick question, whether honesty would be punished or rewarded. Then he shrugged, a gesture that conveyed exhaustion and resignation and stubborn pride all at once. "Honestly, sir, we can keep going as long as we need to."
That's what we do. We drive, we deliver, we turn around and do it again. But it's killing us slowly. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just grinding us down mile by mile until there's nothing left. Some of the guys, they're starting to crack. Making mistakes. Crashing trucks not because of enemy action, but because they literally can't stay awake long enough to reach their destinations. What would help? Webb had asked. If you could change anything about how we're running these convoys, what would it be? Martinez had thought about that, staring into his cold coffee as if the answer might be written in the dregs. Shorter routes, he'd said finally. Better roads, more rest between runs. But those are things you can't control, right? The Germans aren't going to build us better roads, and Patton sure as hell isn't going to stop advancing just to give us time to catch our breath. What if we could speed up the runs? What if we could get the fuel forward faster, more efficiently, so that each truck could make more deliveries in less time? How? Martinez had asked, skepticism clear in his voice. We're already pushing the trucks to their limits. The engines can't go faster without breaking down, and the roads can't handle higher speeds without tearing the suspensions apart. Webb hadn't had an answer that night, had left Martinez to his cold coffee and exhausted contemplation. But the conversation had planted seeds, had started him thinking about efficiency not in terms of conservative planning, but in terms of radical innovation. What if they stopped trying to optimize the existing system and instead built something entirely new? Something purpose-built for the specific challenge of keeping Patton moving. The next morning, Webb had pulled out his old textbooks from Fort Lee, the ones that discussed supply chain theory and traffic management and the science of moving large quantities of goods across complex networks. He'd spent hours reviewing concepts he'd learned years ago, looking for something he might have missed, some principle that could be adapted to their current crisis. And slowly, gradually, an idea had begun to take. Crazy and ambitious and possibly doomed to failure, but also genuinely new, genuinely different from anything that had been tried before. He'd started making notes, sketching out a concept that would require commandeering every available truck, reorganizing the entire supply system around a single priority, and convincing both his superiors and his drivers that what he was proposing wasn't just possible, but necessary. It would mean abandoning the careful distribution of resources across multiple armies, concentrating everything on keeping Patton moving. It would mean gambling that a single, focused effort could succeed where conventional approaches were failing. It would mean building the Green Ball Express. Webb had refined the concept over the next several days, working late into each night, running calculations until his eyes burned and his handwriting became illegible even to himself. He'd consulted with Sarah Brennan about truck availability and driver schedules, with Tom Delaney about fuel supplies and forward storage, with transportation specialists who knew the French road system and could identify the fastest routes from the coast to the front. And slowly, impossibly, the plan had come together. Not elegant, not conservative, but bold and comprehensive, and just crazy enough that it might actually work. His father would have understood, Webb thought. Would have recognized the gamble inherent in concentrating resources rather than distributing them, in betting everything on speed and efficiency rather than hedging with careful reserves. The old man had always said that logistics was ultimately about courage, about being willing to commit fully to a course of action and then making it work through sheer determination and competence. Webb thought about Martha and the girls back in Kansas, going about their lives while he sat in a muddy field in France trying to solve impossible problems. He wrote to them regularly, carefully editing out the stress and the fear and the crushing responsibility, presenting instead a version of the war that was challenging but manageable, difficult but not overwhelming. Martha wrote back with news of school events and neighborhood gossip, and the small dramas of domestic life that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. She never asked him to explain exactly what he did, never pressed for details about his work, and he was grateful for that discretion, for her understanding that some things were better left unspoken.
But sometimes, in his letters, he would include small truths wrapped in careful language, mentions of interesting supply challenges or innovative approaches to transportation problems that hinted at the scope of what he was attempting without revealing details that censors would strike out. And Martha, reading between the lines with the intelligence that had first attracted him to her, would write back with encouragement disguised as domestic updates, telling him about the victory gardens she was maintaining or the scrap metal drive she was organizing, her way of saying that she understood sacrifice, understood that everyone had a part to play in this enormous struggle. Webb looked at the plans spread across his desk, charts showing truck routes, schedules showing delivery times, calculations showing fuel consumption rates and cargo capacities. It all looked so clear on paper, so logical and achievable. But he knew that the gap between planning and execution was where most ambitious schemes fell apart, where the friction of reality ground down even the best ideas into failure and recrimination. Tomorrow, he would present his plan to Bradley's staff, would try to convince men who were cautious by nature and training that this radical departure from standard operating procedure was not just viable, but necessary. He would argue for consolidating resources, for taking risks that made careful planners uncomfortable, for trusting that American drivers and American trucks could accomplish things that the Germans believed impossible. And if he succeeded, if he could pull this off, then maybe those German generals would stop laughing. Maybe they'd realize that American logistics wasn't soft or predictable or bound by European conventions. Maybe they'd learn that the same nation that had mass-produced Liberty ships and built the Hoover Dam and connected a continent with railroads could, when necessity demanded it, build supply lines that would make their carefully hoarded expertise look like amateur work. Webb stubbed out another cigarette and checked his watch. 3 in the morning. In 5 hours, he had a meeting that could make or break his career, that could save Patton's advance or condemn it to failure. He should try to sleep, should give his mind and body the rest they desperately needed. But instead, he pulled out another sheet of paper and started writing. Not plans, not calculations, but a letter to Martha that he knew he'd never send. A letter that told her the truth about what he was attempting and how terrified he was of failing, and how much he wished he could hear her voice telling him that it would all work out somehow. That courage and competence and determination were enough to overcome impossible odds. "Dear Martha," he wrote, "tomorrow I'm going to try to do something that everyone will tell me is impossible. If I succeed, no one will remember my name. Logistics officers don't get parades or medals or history books written about them. If I fail, people will die because supplies didn't arrive when they were needed, and I'll have to live with that knowledge for the rest of my life. I think about you and the girls constantly, use memories of home to push back against the fear and exhaustion. And I promise you this, I will find a way to make this work, because the alternative is accepting defeat, and I refuse to let those German generals be right about us. I refuse to let them laugh." He never finished the letter, eventually folding it carefully and tucking it into his journal, one more private confession among dozens. But writing it had helped, had clarified his thoughts and strengthened his resolve. When morning came, when he walked into that meeting room to present his plan to Bradley's skeptical superior officers, he would do so with the confidence that came from knowing exactly what was at stake and exactly why he couldn't afford to fail. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, the drumming on the tent canvas fading to a gentle patter. Somewhere in the darkness, a truck engine coughed to life, and another convoy began the long drive forward to the front. The work never stopped, couldn't stop, because stopping meant letting the Germans win. And that, more than orders or duty or patriotism, was what kept men like Marcus Webb working through exhaustion and doubt and fear. The simple, unshakable conviction that surrender was not an option, that defeat was unthinkable, that somehow, impossibly, they would find a way to keep the army moving no matter what obstacles stood in their path. The conference room at General Bradley's headquarters smelled of floor wax and old coffee, and the assembled officers looked at Webb with expressions ranging from polite skepticism to barely concealed hostility. He stood at the front of the room, his uniform freshly pressed, but unable to disguise the exhaustion in his eyes.
while behind him a map of France showed the supply situation in unforgiving detail. Blue lines marking Allied positions, red lines showing supply routes, and vast white spaces between them representing the growing gap between what was needed and what could be delivered. Colonel Harrison Graves, the chief logistics officer for Bradley's 12th Army Group, sat at the center of the conference table with his arms crossed, his expression that of a man who'd heard too many ambitious proposals from junior officers who didn't understand the complexity of theater-wide supply operations. Graves was a West Point graduate class of 1920, a regular Army officer who'd spent his entire career in logistics and who treated established doctrine with the reverence that other men reserved for Scripture. Webb knew that convincing Graves would be almost impossible, that the man was constitutionally opposed to innovation, especially innovation proposed by reserve officers who'd learned their trade in civilian freight companies.
"Gentlemen," Webb began, keeping his voice steady despite the nervous energy flooding his system. "The Third Army's advance is consuming fuel at a rate of approximately 800,000 gallons per day. Our current supply system, based on conventional distribution across multiple priorities, is delivering approximately 600,000 gallons per day to all forward units combined. This gap is not sustainable. Within a week, possibly less, General Patton's tanks will be completely immobilized due to fuel exhaustion." "We're aware of the situation, Colonel," Graves said, his tone suggesting that Webb's briefing was unnecessary and unwelcome. "Every unit in France is facing supply shortages. The solution is better prioritization of existing resources, not some radical restructuring of our entire logistics system." "With respect, sir, better prioritization won't solve this problem," Webb said. "The mathematics are absolute. We cannot deliver more fuel through our current distribution network because that network is already operating at maximum capacity. Every truck is running constantly, every driver is working beyond safe limits, and we're still falling short. To supply Patton's advance, we need to fundamentally change our approach." He pulled out a chart showing truck utilization rates, a maze of numbers that told a story of grinding exhaustion and mechanical failure. "Our trucks are currently averaging less than 70% operational readiness, not because of enemy action, because we're working them to death. Engines burning out from continuous operation, tires failing from overloaded weight, drivers falling asleep and crashing. This is the result of trying to maintain conventional supply operations across too many priorities with insufficient resources." Major General Raymond Cooper, Bradley's chief of staff, leaned forward with interest. Unlike Graves, Cooper had a reputation for pragmatism, for being willing to consider unconventional solutions if they could be demonstrated to work. "What are you proposing, Colonel Webb?" He took a breath, knowing that what he was about to say would either change everything or end his career. "I'm proposing we create a dedicated supply corridor exclusively for Third Army operations. We consolidate every available truck into a single, continuous loop, from the ports to forward supply points and back. We paint the route markers green instead of red to distinguish them from regular convoys. We establish one-way roads, maximum speed limits, mandatory rest stops, and priority status that overrides everything else. We call it the Green Ball Express, and we commit to it completely. No half measures, no trying to maintain existing distribution networks alongside it." The room erupted in protests, multiple officers speaking at once. Graves's face had turned red, his control finally slipping. "That's absurd. You're talking about stripping resources from every other unit in France, gambling everything on Patton's advance, abandoning the principle of balanced supply across the theater. It violates every doctrine of logistics management." "It violates peacetime doctrine. But we're not in peacetime, and we're not facing peacetime challenges. General Patton has opened a gap in German defenses that hasn't existed since the breakout. If we can keep him supplied for 2 more weeks, just 2 weeks, he could be across the Seine,
possibly as far as the German border. That kind of advance would collapse the entire German position in France, but only if we can fuel it."
"And if you're wrong?" asked Colonel Michaels, the G4 supply officer for First Army.
"If you strip supplies from other units and Patton's advance stalls anyway, if the Germans counterattack while your precious Green Ball Express has left other sectors undersupplied, you're talking about a gamble that could cost us the entire campaign."
Webb had expected this argument, had prepared for it during those long nights of planning.
The Germans are already defeated in France, they just don't know it yet. Every intelligence report shows them retreating in disorder, unable to establish defensive lines, hemorrhaging equipment and personnel. The only thing that can save them now is if we stop advancing, if we give them time to regroup and reinforce. Conventional logistics is designed for conventional warfare, for careful advance and consolidated positions. But Patton isn't fighting a conventional war. He's fighting a pursuit, a rout, and pursuit requires different logistics. It requires reckless logistics, apparently. Colonel Webb, your enthusiasm is noted, but this proposal is simply too radical, too risky. We have procedures for managing supply shortages, established protocols that have been tested in previous campaigns. I recommend we increase pressure on port operations to improve throughput, adjust our distribution priorities to allocate more fuel to Third Army, and accept that advances will be limited by our logistical capabilities. That's not defeatism, that's realism. Webb felt frustration rising, fought to keep it out of his voice. This was exactly what he'd feared, that professional caution would kill the plan before it even had a chance to succeed. That men who'd spent their careers following established procedures would be unable to imagine alternatives. He glanced at Major General Cooper, trying to read his expression, looking for any sign of support.